Welcome everyone to this Regen leaders debate, focused on the green recovery. Mistake to mention that this week we're normally in Bath for Regen's Renewable Futures and Green Energy Awards conference, but can't all be together this year. But we are able to use the magic of Zoom, etc., to bring us all together. And we've been using this opportunity of the kind of changed circumstances to run a number of online sessions focused around our mission of the transformation of the energy systems to a zero carbon future, and also in the context of a green recovery from the pandemic. So that's been the focus of a number of events we've been running, and this, if you like, is the sort of the keynote, a leaders debate. Now, there is a lot to discuss. So we've recently had a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. We've had the announcements for those more in the power side on contracts for difference. And yesterday, those of you who've been keeping up will have noticed the National Infrastructure Strategy, part of the spending review, which has, perhaps it could be argued, certainly on perhaps the power side, to be the most significant of all of them in terms of what it says. So this, I guess, is the month where this government, this administration, really set out its path to net zero and to tackling the climate emergency. And I guess at a point where, the beginning of what a number of people have described as the most important decade in human history, that the question then is for this session, and it's really quite a simple one, is now, are we now on the right track? We've set our legally binding target. Now we've actually got a good chunk of the direction of travel, the plans to get there. Are we going on the right way? Are we doing enough? So that sets up the question for today, a nice simple one. So our agenda today, how we're going to do that, we're going to start, thank you Hannah for magically bringing that up, and as our producer down in Exeter. So we're going to start with a chat through with Declan, who's Director of Clean Power Strategy and Deployment at BEIS, just to get a little bit more sense of all those announcements, what they mean, what's in them. And then we've got a panel session, and we've got a fantastic panel there, so we'll introduce them as we come to them. We do have quite a lot of people today, so we've gone with lots of voices, and so we're going to have to keep it really pretty quick fire. I'm sure they'll do that, but we decided it would be great to have a wide range of views today and sort of try and cram those into an hour and a half. So thank you everyone for participating today. Okay, let's kick off and bring in Declan. So good morning, Declan. Been a busy morning. Thank you. Busy couple of weeks, and energy white paper still to come. I don't know if you've been managing to fit in the Christmas shopping, but I guess how's it been for you? It seems like a pretty intense time. Is there something you particularly want to point people to as sort of key announcements?
Morning Merlin, and thanks for inviting me along. Certainly feels like a pretty intense time, but I would say in quite a positive way. For those of us working in the space, I'm sure you and other colleagues at the conference this morning, a sense of real momentum, I suppose, kind of kicking off with the 10-point plan from the Prime Minister, as you say, which kind of went across the energy space, but a lot of really interesting things and kind of the areas I'm involved in. National Infrastructure Strategy yesterday from Treasury, you said there was quite an important theme around decarbonisation and what the transition means. When you think about infrastructure now, clearly the decarbonisation of the economy is a big part of that. And yes, it's been kept very busy on Energy White Paper, which you'll have seen we promised to put out before the end of the year. So yeah, busy, but kind of a sense of momentum, kind of a positive sense of, I guess, the right trajectory on our side.
Excellent, and it must be an exciting place to be part of and be leading at the moment. And probably worth us taking a chance to sort of thank all the officials at BEIS for, I imagine, and Treasury. I imagine there's a lot of hard work, and perhaps always get the recognition. But just so thinking about then the sort of the vision of the future the government's now setting out. So looking at the National Infrastructure Commission, the National Infrastructure Strategy, basically it says, well, firstly, we're going to need a lot more power. There's a reference, I think, to in the Committee on Climate Change report suggesting 4 times as much renewables needed as now, sort of future. It sets a target, which it then says isn't a target, as 65% power from renewables by 2030. I think we're 40, depending on whether you take a quarter or a year or whatever, 45%, something like that at the moment. We're going to need a lot of flex, so interconnected storage, demand side response. But there is still a requirement for what it describes as reliable sources of power, by which it means nuclear, CCS, etc. So that's a vision. That's quite a clear kind of vision of the future, which I think is very helpful to investors. I guess my first question is whether that phrase that we still need reliable sources of power, does that suggest that there's still a kind of classic incumbent discourse that the future of a digital decentralized system, that I think a lot of the market investors see as the future, that there's still a bit of a hankering for a big thing you can put on a hard hat and a yellow vest and go and open, has a big red button you can press. And is there a risk in 10 years we're going to be looking back saying, we didn't really get on board with the speed and scale of this transition. We were still hankering after the past in terms of that need for a big, reliable source of power.
Interesting question to start with, Merlin. I think starting with what you started with there, electrification is going to be a big part of the decarbonisation of the economy. As you say, CCC, I think doubling of the need for electricity, and then if we have half low carbon now, roughly into kind of building 4 times more. And the other thing I suppose people are very clear on is it's not just about building generation, but it's the network, the systems, the markets, the kind of the software that goes around the hardware is going to be really, really critical. And I think what we're really sort of saying is the benefit and the value in a balanced system. So you use as much tools as you can in the toolbox to kind of meet the challenge ahead of us. And it's a significant challenge, doubling the amount of low carbon, doubling the amount of total electricity. I think flex networks storage is going to be an incredibly important part. So I think there's no kind of diminution in the value of that. I think it's about more pushing forward in kind of multiple areas, is probably how I would describe it. And you'd have seen, whether it's the 60% or whatever number you put next to renewables. And again, if you look at the CCP analysis, I think you're seeing a system that's majority, the foundation now is going to be a renewable system, we think. If you look at things like offshore wind and other things, they've proven they can come down the cost curve. They're probably going to be the backbone of the electricity system. And then it's kind of what you put around them to get the lowest cost overall system. So one of the themes I pull out, and I hope we'll be touching on this in the white paper as well, is increasingly just thinking about it as an overall system. I think that's going to be incredibly important. And then there's going to be massive importance attached to kind of things like flexibility, storage, decentralization, and having kind of as smart a system as we can to get maximum bang for our generation.
Okay, excellent. So that, I guess, leads on neatly to a commitment, I think, in both the CFD document where it describes it as a review of renewable support, and the National Infrastructure Commission documents which describe it as a kind of rethinking of CFDs. It highlights that in a world where you've got a lot of zero marginal cost power, that's a very different world to the traditional world. Will the system is the system right? It stresses the importance of thinking, as you say, about total system costs. And there was a kind of an interesting kind of forerunner of that in the debate around CFDs about whether when prices are negative, if you've got a contract for difference, you still get paid or not. So these questions are really starting to kind of bubble up. I guess, could you give, so we're talking about a review of renewable support. Can you give us any, and obviously you're not going to give us the answer today because that's just started, but what are some of the options that might be involved? What sorts of things might be done differently?
So I suppose I would say, first of all, I think the CFD and the instruments we've got in place have done a really good job. We've seen very significant deployment. We've seen the cost of capital come down. We've mobilized a lot of capital. And I think one of the themes of the NIS is how important that's going to be. I think they talk about whether it's going to be a particular role for government. For example, you've seen the spending review yesterday, a fund towards carbon capture and storage, so to get markets up and running and moving. But so probably important to kind of say, given the level of deployment ambitions we've got, the instruments we've got at the moment have been very successful in bringing forward kind of huge volumes of renewables deployment and bringing the costs down as well. So I think it's going to be a matter of just thinking about, as we bring more and more on the system, balancing the need to have the kind of the lowest cost overall system. You mentioned like negative pricing, for example, in AR4. But I think it's going to be important that it's going to be a measured look at what's working, what can be refined, because we also have significant deployment ambitions, and it's important we sort of get that balance right. So I wouldn't be kind of calling about a big kind of review or anything. That's, I think, signaling that the overall, it's just going back, I suppose, to that kind of systems approach. It's important we look across the energy system, not just in terms of kind of what we want that system to look like, but how the different instruments we have talk to each other. I think it's going to be an important theme, but the one thing I would highlight is the importance to kind of maintain investor confidence as well as something that will be kind of very much forefront of our minds.
Okay, so it's a kind of, not perhaps to read too much into that renewable support, but I mean, one thing obviously people will be very interested in is just the amount of support. And for we've mentioned CFDs, so on that, there's a signal of 12 gigs of capacity compared to about 5.5, 5.8 last time round, which was all offshore wind. I don't think we've seen anything yet which suggests that the split between the different pots, between onshore wind and solar, offshore wind, and then new stuff. When might we get a sense? So if I'm sitting there thinking about my portfolio of solar farms I'm thinking investing in, or Keith is there with his portfolio of onshore wind farms, or wondering how much effort to put into these, and is there going to be a route to market? How much of that you're going to be supporting is obviously a critical question.
So first of all, as you say, it's a very significant increase in ambition. So kind of doubling what we did last time. If you compare it kind of internationally, there's a huge level of ambition for the next allocation round of the CFD, which we're super excited about, given the results in the last allocation round. And as you say, this time we'll be including kind of the top one technology, so onshore and solar as well. So kind of the way we'll be typically doing it is we'll be kind of looking at kind of the pipeline, what that looks like, providing advice to ministers. So kind of the timing I probably can't quite confirm now, but I think we talked about the option being autumn of next year. I think is the sort of timing we sort of indicated from the top of my head. So yeah, it'll certainly be ahead of that. I probably can't give a precise date right now, but that's typically the way we'll be looking at it. So we'll be providing advice to ministers. But the good thing I suppose that I want people to take is A, the volume of ambition, and B, kind of the allowing other technologies as well as offshore wind to be part of this.
Okay, so sometime before the autumn, there'll be some clarity of how much will go into each pot. Okay,
yeah, that would be my expectation. We'll advise ministers.
Just pulling back up to what you were talking about the kind of system change. There's also talk about review of system governance, specifically the ESO, and just and the phrases in there about a review of the approach to governance of the whole system. So again, we're quite a lot of change, I guess, and thinking there. What are the kind of issues? Why might we be thinking of shifting around who controls what in terms of system operation?
So one of the interesting things is, as you kind of think about the level of change that's going on in the system, it's just as we talk to a lot of people in the market, interesting, speaking a lot to you, Merlin, on regular occasions and market participants. I guess one of the things that is just being thought about is, as we kind of chart that transition on the level of change we're seeing, is it sort of clear who's doing what? And maybe the answer is yes, but just kind of thinking about as we manage that transition, are the roles and responsibilities in the right place? I think that's kind of what that's signaling. I see Neil's on the panel, so I'm sure Neil can watch him with kind of interesting views and observations on this as well. But it's the level of change we're sort of going to be seeing in the system, that it's a sort of healthy thing to do. And I think that's what the news is referring to.
Okay. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about whether the ESO, the regulatory approach and price controls works for a system operator, which isn't an asset holder like most of the other networks and the like. And they make a good point that they kind of need to go first in a way. You need the system operator to be setting up the markets, etc., for us to move towards net zero. So I guess we all see that as a particularly important role. You mentioned within that so there's the DSO, and then there's also Ofgem and the regulator, and it talks in the papers about importance of aligning policy and regulation together, strategic direction, policy, regulation aligned, and that interesting phrase, if achieved, this will create greater certainty. Does that, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but if achieved, it would, from the outside, seem relatively straightforward for government to align its policy and its regulation after it's all sort of part of the, I know one's policy, one's an independent regulator, but it's kind of all part of the same thing to most people from the outside. If achieved, does that signal some sense of some sense of distance between government and the regulator in some of these agendas?
I think you possibly are reading too much into that one. No, I think it's just kind of emphasizing, the scale of change we're talking about here is going to flow through the government, regulator. It's going to be a big thing for all of us acting in the energy space, whether that's BEIS or Ofgem or so forth. And I can tell you, me and Neil speak very often to each other. So no, I don't think, there's an appropriate distance as we expect for an independent regulator. But I don't think he's pointing to anything kind of beyond that, I would say.
Okay. I guess I picked that up because from one of the issues that's the industry and the sector and others have thought about, and we'll talk a bit more about with Neil, as you say, is whether Ofgem is still too focused on lowest cost, whether it's really getting behind the net zero agenda as quickly in some of the more detailed things that actually send very critical signals in the market. But let's come back to that. We talked mainly about power, and that's kind of, I guess, the core of your role. But you've talked about being a system. We've talked about a shift to electric vehicles. We've talked about 600 targets for 600,000 heat pumps a year. Yeah. I think it's about, according to our figures, 20,000, maybe 30,000 a year. 30,000 a year at the moment. The documents, the infrastructure strategy, talk about 1.7 million heating systems being installed each year by 2030 need to be net zero ready, compared to 30,000 a year. So this is the huge challenge, and it's one that involves, it can't be just done by shifting a few power stations around. It involves everybody, involves local authorities and their planning, it involves all of us and our households and our own individual heating decisions. So because one of the things that's perhaps causing some lack of clarity out there in the industry is the sort of balance of electrification, perhaps green gases and hydrogen. Do we need clearer signals in these areas from government, or say it feels like there's been this sort of, it's difficult for everyone out there to sort of get on with this job, whilst there's still not, there's still some very different visions of the future out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose what I'd kind of point to is, what we're doing, for example, in the 600,000 heat pumps that the Prime Minister set out in the 10-point plan, is one of the things we hear from the supply chain and industry is, and a bit maybe parallel to offshore wind, but I can use an example from the area I'm more familiar with, the benefit of having a target. So we're going to be going after this. It will need to happen in volume and scale. I think there's a question around, you'll also see us doing a number of things on the hydrogen side as well. So, there's a degree of taking enabling measures, sending signals, for example, to kind of the heat pump industry. This is going to be a big, if you're a manufacturer, if you're training to be an installer, for example, sending that signal that this is going to be a really important thing, I think is important. So hopefully that gives a sense of the kind of the scale. If we talk about the level of turnover we'll see in low carbon heating systems, sending that signal that this is going to be a really important part of the energy transition, obviously. And hopefully then you sort of see industry mobilize behind it, whether that's innovation, whether that's kind of deployment plans. I think that's the sort of thing that we'll hope to see.
So there's perhaps quite a lot of clarity about the next 10 years, what's described as low regret measures, and then the idea we might have a hydrogen town up running by 2030, and then we can all think a bit about the sort of the next stage. But I think perhaps what you're saying is that the next 10 years, actually on heat, there is a fair amount of clarity of direction, but we're all waiting for a heat and building strategy. That's yet another of these
Absolutely.
documents. Excellent. Okay, just last thought, just teeing up discussion in terms of the, you've mentioned this is a huge change, it affects everybody, and one of the questions that comes up is about fairness, and the front of the National Infrastructure Strategy actually has a fairer as one of its 3 slogan words, and there's been talked about just transitions and obviously the jobs agenda, and that in this it also talks about the net zero review by Treasury of who pays, where costs lie, etc. I mean, we see still, I think, in some of the policies, to give you an example, some kind of outcomes which might not be particularly acceptable. So I guess a good example was electric vehicles charging. If you've got a driveway, you can take account, you can give Keith or Juliet here a call, or one of the many other excellent other suppliers are available, and get a nice off-peak tariff, and I could be charging my electric vehicle for, I don't know, 5p per kilowatt hour. If I don't have an off-street parking at the moment, I'm going to have to charge at a public car facility, and my experience is those are about 35p. So we're talking 7 times the price. In other words, if I'm not rich enough to afford a house with a driveway, I pay 7 times as much for my transport. So any kind of, I guess, thoughts on how government is going to kind of try and navigate this sort of fairer, just transition?
Yeah, a really central point, Merlin. I think there's quite a bit to the social aspect, the wider impact of the energy transition we'll see. I would bring out the jobs bit you mentioned. I think that is incredibly important. And you'll see in the 10-point plan, for every point, there's a real focus on what we think is going to be doing for jobs in the UK. And then it plays a lot into kind of specific places in the UK as well. You look at CCS and some other things, for example. You mentioned the net zero review that the Treasury are doing. And I think one of the kind of key things that we'll be picking up on is kind of issues around kind of costs, I suppose, and kind of distribution and so forth. So bringing people with us so they can see the employment opportunities the energy transition is creating. And then making sure, I think it's a good point you referred to, as we see technology being available to people, helping them have more control over their costs and so forth, making sure there's not a kind of people being left behind by that transition, I think is definitely going to be a really important thing. Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. Whilst I'll make one last plea for a detail that had particular interest to us in relation to this, as I noticed under the CFDs, there's the pledge to update the guidance on the community engagement for wind farms, onshore wind farms. That's something actually Regen wrote the last draft of about 8-9 years ago, one of my early days at Regen, and we've been suggesting that should definitely be extended beyond onshore wind to solar and other technologies. It's a decision not to do that, but I will put another in the documents. I'll put another lobby in when I get the chance to say I think that's definitely a mistake. Having spent many a happy hour on various local TV stations with very upset people about solar farms talking to me, I'm absolutely convinced of the importance that all technologies really do proper community engagement. So
community engagement is critically important, for sure. Absolutely. One example I would cite, it's maybe a different approach, but looking at, for example, offshore connections and how those are kind of managed in the right way. So the impact of all this infrastructure we talked about in local communities is absolutely considered carefully.
Okay, we may, I imagine, come back to community engagement with Juliet, who I think once described it to me as like jumping in a cold swimming pool. You're a bit nervous before you do it, but it's refreshing when you do. So that's the excellent. Thank you very much, Declan. That's great. We're going to open up now to our broader panel. So I'll invite Hannah to what are the magic, or invite people to switch on their cameras and microphones. I was going to start with Sam, actually, who has introduced himself in his role at the Conservative Environment network. And just I'll perhaps set us up with a bit about the politics about this. How core is this now to this administration? Is this now like one of its key kind of themes? And I guess the same question to the broader sort of mass, if I could put it that way, of Conservative MPs.
I think it is a core issue for this government and this administration now. I mean, arguably that goes back to the Conservative manifesto at the last election, when net zero was one of the top election guarantees in that manifesto. I think it has, Boris Johnson very early in his leadership campaign committed to delivering on the net zero target. So, I do think this is a priority, and I think the fact that the Prime Minister personally headed up the 10-point plan and launched it himself, I think is a sign of how seriously they take it. And I think for the rest of this Parliament, the job is going to be about economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. And I think, again, a theme of all the announcements we've had recently is that the government does now see investments in net zero projects as a route to economic growth. We had the £3 billion energy efficiency fund over the summer from the Chancellor, and then again all the Green Industrial Revolution plan from Boris Johnson. So I am optimistic. I mean, I know some people were disappointed at the lack of new announcements in the spending review yesterday, but I think lots of those were included in the 10-point plan, and some of the measures, things like the levelling up fund and the new infrastructure bank, I'm confident can help deliver some of this agenda as well if they're designed in the right way and have explicit net zero goals.
Okay, and the broader Tory MP caucus. I mean, I think we've already seen in this government with in this administration that actually groups of Tory MPs coming together can be very significant in influencing. Traditionally, I guess we've had a bit of a split in the Conservative Party between the sort of the great environmentalists, if I could put it that way, like the John Gummers and the Nigel Lawsons. Where do you see, percentage-wise, how much is in each of those camps?
I don't know whether I could put a percent, but what I can say is that the size of the Sen caucus, so this is the set of backbench Conservative MPs and peers that we work with, has trebled in the last year. So, and all those people are signing up to taking action on climate change. So, I think the mood in the party definitely is shifting decisively in favour of investments and policies. And I think crucially, obviously a big debate in the Conservative Party at the moment is about how do they retain the new Conservative voters in the so-called red wall constituencies. I think the narrative that the government has set out behind the Green Industrial Revolution, is laser targeted at those voters. Lots of focus grouping and polling that they want to hear about jobs and bringing back industry to those communities. And I think the way that the government's framing it is helping bring on board some of those new Conservative MPs and some of their voters as well. So I think that the framing we have now is helping definitely shore up support in the parliamentary party for the.
Okay, well, fascinating to hear how the sort of feedback from focus groups is leading to the framing of some of these debates, some of these policies. One more thought then. I guess some of the criticism of this government generally has been about its the headline and the message overall is great, and I think all of us on day, as you say, the day that a Prime Minister sets out a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, we should all welcome those kind of days. The question comes, I guess, when they come to the hard choices along the way, of which there are clearly some, the politically difficult moments, will they back away? And I pray in evidence, I think is the phrase, isn't it? I give you in evidence that the 10-point plan on Wednesday had a future home standard by 2023, which includes, I think the signals are, a ban on gas boilers in new homes, and by Thursday, that had been airbrushed out and into history for who knows what shenanigans within the department. But so, is there a risk that as the messaging is great, the headline's great, but when we get to those hard choices, politically difficult decisions, of which, of course, there are going to be some in a transition like this, that's where they sort of back away?
I think that is definitely a risk. I mean, I would say that in the 10-point plan, the headline announcement, my personal highlight was the 2030 phase-out date for new petrol and diesel car sales, and that is not an uncontroversial decision. Like, lots of car companies were very strongly opposed to that, but there are groups of Conservative MPs that were not keen on that, and the government has grasped the nettle on that in face of lots of criticism from motoring groups. You know, and I think that shows that it is willing to do what it takes to meet the net zero targets. You know, I think heat is definitely going to be difficult, and arguably, you know, the 10-point plan didn't hedged its bets on that, and decided to kind of keep going and with keeping both options open in terms of pumps versus hydrogen. And I think that's difficult. There's a lot of thinking going on in think tank land about how best to deliver that, how to frame it in a way that won't cost votes, cost an election. But yeah, it is going to be difficult, and I think the government is doing the right thing in terms of funding energy efficiency, building the early heat pump market, and trying to get the cost down of those technologies so that the choice when it does come is a bit easier. But yeah, I mean, that feels to me like the point where this will really get tested.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Sam. I think we'll bring in Keith at this point. Keith, I mean, your Scottish Power obviously covers a number of areas, but particularly, you know, you've talked a lot about infrastructure recently, and you've been quite critical of Ofgem's price controls, and you know, the fact the pipes. If we're going to deliver all this change, you know, the pipes and the wires and infrastructure are going to be critical. Are you seeing now what's coming out of government? How are you feeling?
So can you hear me? Okay, yeah, perfect, good. So 10-point plan, fantastic, brilliant. I mean, lots of people can argue about what's in it, what's not in it, is it the right stuff, etc., etc. But what is it? As an investor, as a business, as an energy company, what is it you're looking for from the government? You look for that kind of ambition. You look for those high-level targets. You look for that direction. So the stuff about the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, we knew it was going there anyway. The stuff around the phase out of internal combustion engines, we knew it was coming, but it's brilliant to see it documented, and we all know where we're headed or trying to get to. I suppose the word of caution around that is, once a wise old sage once said to me about 15 years ago when I started getting involved in all this stuff in the industry, which is setting targets is easy. The difficult bit is delivering. And it's been quite interesting, I think, on the back of, and maybe it's because some of it was trailed up front, but on the back of the 10-point plan announcement, it's been interesting to see how quickly the conversations flip to, well, okay, how are we going to do it? How do we get this done? How do we get it built? How do we get it through the system? How do we make sure the regulatory process works? How do we make sure the planning process works? And those are big challenges, and it does drive you down to what a lot of people have talked about in the past, and it all sounds a bit sort of esoteric and weird and wonderful, but a systems-based approach. And it really does lend itself to that, because even if you look at the topic of offshore wind, it links to almost everything else in the 10-point plan. Because if you want to electrify the heat system, you need more renewable energy from offshore wind. It links to the EV transition, because if you want all these electric cars on the road, you need to provide the power for them. It has to be renewable energy. It links to offshore wind. If you look at, as I say, almost anything in that plan, they are all completely interlinked. And at the heart of it all, there's a huge, huge, big conversation about how do you shift all of this energy about, i.e. the core infrastructure of the entire sector, which is the transmission system and the distribution system. Are they fit for purpose? Can they do this? Simple answer is no, and that's not a criticism. It's just a statement of fact, because the system is changing so quickly and so rapidly. The needs going forward to hit net zero are coming at us incredibly rapidly. So the system today can't cope with what we need it to do in 2030 or 2040, and that's a fact of life. I think we do need some mindset change around all of that, though, because we do, and I've heard at least one person mention the wonderful phrase already, the phrase of anticipatory investment. And we still do have this kind of mindset in the country about, oh, are we willing to take a risk? Are we willing to anticipate where we're all going? I kind of think that mindset needs to change incredibly quickly in this country, because it's not anticipatory investment at all. We know we're phasing out internal combustion engines. We know we need 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. We know we need to decarbonise the heat system. etc., etc., etc. So let's get on and build the system capable of delivering that. This is not a risk. It's not like we're sitting here still humming and hawing and debating, is climate change real? That conversation's gone. It's not like we're still sitting debating, do we want to get to net zero by 2050? Well, we've put that in legislation. So we need to actually start acting out and behaving differently and doing things differently. And if I kind of look at the last 2 or 3 years, while all this conversation has been going on the ground, what's actually changed? And we talk about a climate emergency, and we talk about accelerating all these, all the targets, and we talk about being more ambitious. Actually, on the ground, it's difficult to see that ambition on a day-to-day basis coming through the system. And that's what we need to fix and change really, really quickly. Now, that's not me being critical, it's just stuff's moving fast. But where this does become critical, and you start looking at making sure everybody's lined up, is that we really need to fix this incredibly quickly in the next couple of years. So if you want that offshore wind target by 2030, if you want that EV target by 2030, if you want to start changing the heat system by 2030, we need to make massive changes to the grid system in the next couple of years. If you need new grid connections onshore and offshore, unless they are in the system in the next couple of years, they aren't going to be there by 2030. If you want the EVs, unless we make changes to the distribution system in the next couple of years, the stuff's not going to be there by 2030. So we need to up the pace and up the speed. And again, that's not me being critical of Ofgem. I'm not blaming Ofgem for all of this. You can't turn around and say, oh, well, there you go, the government are good and we're good. It's all the fault of the regulator. That's completely nonsense, and it would be a stupid argument. But and to be fair to the regulator, if I think about when the industry submitted its plans for the next round of investment in the transmission system, there was no pandemic. It didn't exist. We hadn't heard of it. We hadn't invented it. We hadn't tried to tackle it, let alone think about vaccines. So in the period between building business plans for T2 investment and 12 days from now, when we do a final determination of T2, the world has changed. The test for the United Kingdom, and this is a test for government, a test for regulators, a test for stakeholders, and a test for the industry, is, are you adaptable, flexible, and fast enough to respond what's going on around you? And that's the concern I have. I'm not too sure as a country we are. I think an awful lot of the bodies, the frameworks, the processes we have don't react fast enough. They don't change quickly enough. They don't adapt quickly enough. And I think that's the, if you like, that's the debate you're seeing play out. You're seeing it play out in the transmission system just now. You're going to see it play out any day now as regards to the distribution system for EVs. You'll see it play out, and you're seeing it playing out now about building all the offshore wind farms and developers saying, well, for my projects now, I'm being offered a connection date of 2030. How the hell are you going to do 40 gigawatts by then if I can't build the ones I've got now by then? And it's the test for all of us, the test for the country is, can you react as quickly as you're setting your ambition?
Okay.
History would say no, but there's a big bloody opportunity for us to flip that. And just one statistic I'll give you, which relates to our company and our group. 3 days before the Prime Minister announced his 10-point plan, we announced as a group where we're going to invest 75 billion euros between now and 2025. Now, 10 billion pounds of that is coming to the United Kingdom, and 10 billion pounds is brilliant and it's good. However, over the last 5 years, our group was investing 30 to 35% of its capital in the UK. That percentage is dropping and falling every time. Why? It's not because we don't like the UK. It's not because we don't think there's lots of opportunity in the UK. The issue with the UK compared to America, compared to Spain, compared to other countries is speed, opportunity, and attractiveness. Now, every one of those is within the control of this country. And every one of those you need to fix if you want to hit all these targets. And every one of those you need to get working as one system if you want to deliver net zero. And that's the challenge we've got.
Excellent. Okay, Keith, that's set it up very, very nicely. And I think naturally I could only really come to Neil at that point and invite Ofgem to set out how they're feeling about the kind of net zero agenda. And Neil, you've heard the challenge from Keith. I don't think I could put it any better than that, but I might also add in the challenge from Darren Jones, the chair of the Select Committee, who recently wrote to Jonathan Brearley, welcoming the kind of commitment to net zero, but saying, we're worried it's not carried through sufficiently to price control. So has that kind of headline commitment to net zero decarbonisation act, is it really coming through into the kind of speed and ambition of the processes you manage?
100%. Look, I can see why people are asking the question, but Ofgem is absolutely on the front foot and completely committed to this net zero agenda. We set it out in our strategic narrative last summer, and the new chief executive, not so new anymore, but Jonathan Brearley started his time in as chief executive in February, and on day one published a decarbonisation action plan from Ofgem. In terms of what we're doing specifically to enable investment, we recognise we're at an absolute critical point in the investment cycle for enabling net zero. So as you're probably aware, we've got the price control comes in sort of two big chunks. The first chunk, which is reaching final determinations, as Keith said, in a few days, is about the transmission grid and the gas network. The second chunk is about the distribution network, and that runs on a 2-year slower cycle. But what we're doing on transmission, we set out in draft over the summer, which on net zero, we approved in principle 90% of all the decarbonisation investments proposed by the network companies, and there were very good reasons why we didn't approve all of them. But more importantly than that, recognising the need to go further, and indeed to go further than the companies set out in their business cases, we established a new facility, which is a set of reopeners to enable £10 billion or more, if those projects can come forward, of investment in additional transmission capacity in the coming 5 years to enable net zero. So that's all sorts of things from, primarily it's connecting new renewables projects to the grid and other such investments. But this is a complete change and a complete realization of the need to have on the table the need for a facility that can respond quickly and approve the new investments that need to be made over the coming years. And that's just transmission. So as I say, we've got the distribution system and all that investment required to enable electric vehicles and heat pumps. All of that is coming down the line in what's called ED2, electricity distribution price control. So there's a whole nother swathe of investment that will be unlocked through that process.
Is there a danger that by saying, okay, that's we're going to have all these kind of reopeners or triggers for more investment. So rather than just saying upfront, right, we all know where we're going, let's get on and build it. If we build a few, if we don't get it absolutely right, well, that's small beer in the scale of saving the planet. As opposed to, well, we're not quite sure, therefore we're going to have a reopener. And now we've created a kind of bureaucratic system where Ofgem has to sit in its I would have said it's ivory tower and Canary Wharf, but it's in its bedrooms and kind of assess each of Keith's proposals over the years to come. Why not just say, look, we know where we're going, it's not going to be wasted, let's get on with it.
So look, I've got some sympathy for what Keith was saying. We all know what destination we're headed towards, which is net zero, and Ofgem is determined to play our part in enabling the investments to get there. But we can't approve projects before they're developed. We can't write a blank check. We have to protect energy consumers, and so it's about getting the right balance. And I think the net zero reopener facility does exactly that. And obviously, we're going to make sure it's designed in a way that doesn't provide, a massive, long bureaucratic process that delays important projects. We've absolutely clocked the need for a process that is sufficiently fast to to make sure that we're on the front foot. And
okay,
when it comes,
you used the phrase you used the phrase protect consumers, and I guess there are, there's protecting consumers from rises in their electricity bills, and absolutely important. But there's also protecting consumers from, well, frankly, being underwater, from a climate emergency, which I think stepping back in 10 years, one and look back at Ofgem's performance, you probably argue at that point that its performance on that was the most important of these issues. So is that balance? I mean, Ofgem at the moment, all its documents tends to say we need to do these one thing on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to protect consumers from costs. We need to also think about decarbonisation. Does that balance need to change? Does it need to say, first of all, we need a functioning planet? That's our priority one. And then, yes, we need to get there in the most efficient way.
So I think the two are integral. So Ofgem's role, net zero, is a given. It's legislated in law. It's integrated into our duties. Actually, reducing greenhouse gases is part of what we need to do as an organisation. It's set out in statute. So we have, for us, it's about delivering net zero at least cost to consumers. It's not a choice between do we deliver net zero or do we keep energy bills low. We will deliver net zero. We will enable that. But actually, so it's come back to some basic first principles. Private investment is going to be absolutely vital to delivering the net zero transition. That's 100% crystal clear. And Ofgem has an enabling role in ensuring that investment flows at low cost of capital by providing a reliable, predictable regulatory regime. It enables private capital to flow at low enough cost of capital that consumers don't pay more than they need to. So, and we can see that obviously on networks. We're also hoping, if government asks us to do so, we can play the same role in helping to provide a regulatory framework to enable CCS and new nuclear investments, again, at a lower cost to consumers than would otherwise be the case. So I think there's a critical role for Ofgem to play, and we're keen to play it. We're gearing up to deliver these things in the coming years, and we're acting differently. We are becoming more adaptive. The reopeners are a sign of things to come for us.
Excellent. Juliet, I was going to ask you particularly about the kind of how much do we need to rethink the system, the wholesale energy market, the way it, as a supplier, as a trader, as a developer, in a moving to a world of zero cost power, etc. But I imagine also that you've probably got some reflections on what you've heard so far. So over to you.
Yeah, got a few thoughts, mate. Thanks, Merlin. And Keith, thanks for your impassioned speech. Normally it's me doing the impassioned, but it's great to have somebody else out there. I guess if I take a step back, I think we've talked about sort of 4 pillars that we think we need to see shift in this marketplace, and some of them have different timing. So the first one is R&D and innovation, and obviously that's a slightly longer term piece. We've talked about the next 10 years, but we will need to start investing in the new technologies, the new business models for the future now. We can't wait to do that. And I have to say, slightly disappointingly, I recently saw sort of the announcements around what's being spent in innovation and the government announcements about sort of what the future spend is in those areas is lower than I would expect. And I think we need to keep pushing on government to make sure the spend is coming into the energy systems, R&D and energy systems innovation. I think is a really important area that's slightly been left behind. The next part we touched on quite a lot, which is infrastructure. Now, we've mainly talked about electricity infrastructure today, but obviously you've still got the gas networks. What are we going to do with those? What are those going to become of the future? And I do think we need to start having some real thought leadership around that. What do we do? Do we convert them all to hydrogen, or do we start to get rid of some of them, or what is the plan? But at the same time, sort of what is the plan around EV infrastructure? And Merlin, you touched on that earlier about the fairness of EV structures. And I actually am seeing some technologies and some ideas coming through that I think we can deliver fairness in that sector to all people. That you don't have to have a drive. Your electricity bill could follow you wherever you went. You could get that deal whatever charging point you went to. But I think we've got to make sure that the the regulation, the thought pattern, and Ofgem is incredibly important in this, but so is OLAV and so is Treasury, is making sure that some of this data is open, that we're really trying to bring some innovative models in that will deliver that fairness, because that's where I think business and new business models are some of the best way to help deliver fairness. Coming to the wholesale market, which was the question you really wanted to ask me. Yeah, I mean, we have a wholesale market that was designed around a high carbon market. So marginal cost set by coal plant generally, now maybe gas plant. But as those plants start to become less and less on the system, your marginal plant will be set by zero cost fuels, which just doesn't work. You're not going to be getting the long-term signals through. Now, we've seen the new announcements on CFDs, but that's only just a part of the marketplace. It doesn't deliver anything to do with time of day. It doesn't talk about anything related to flexibility. So the structure of all those markets are not aligned yet to really bring those messages through and allow more participants in. Because what worries me is if we go down a pure CFD marketplace, we don't get messages coming through to consumers. And consumers, well, we have a very windy system. So we have a windy grid plugging into, I guess, a southern solar grid. I do believe that the more you can do behind the meter, the more you can get consumers to be part of the system and not put more stress on the system, the lower cost we're going to deliver on the system. And if they can become part of it and reduce the cost of the fact that we'll have variable wind, we'll have potentially hydrogen sorting that, but the less impact demand can have, the better. And we need to design a marketplace that allows those players to be part of this marketplace, whether it's with electric heating, because think of it, electric heating, you can put, as long as you've got reasonable insulation in the home, you can use a heat as a storage. You've got EVs, you've got battery in every car that's been traveling around our country. I mean, that's a massive battery system, virtual battery system on its own. So I think we have to rethink the way this market is structured and regulated. And then finally, obviously, the thing I'm most passionate about as well is consumers. I mean, consumers need to be protected through this transmission. They are going to be an incredibly important part of it. And we need to make sure that they're not being missold. They're not buying a heat pump that doesn't deliver anything, or that's sort of bad quality. So there's a lot of regs. And the most recent, Keith and I were both on something recently, which was on greenwashing, and what we've seen in this market to date on people selling green products that aren't really green, is that consumers believe that they are protected by regulation and regulators. And I don't think we have somebody in this space who properly understands that ASA can't do this work. They're not going to understand how the technology of a heat pump is going to work. They don't understand the green electricity markets. They don't understand any of this. So I think there is a role there, a bigger role for Ofgem potentially, or a green consumer guidance. I'm not sure what it is. But I think you need all of that, and different parts of it are playing different roles at different points in time.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. I mean, you kind of teed up Simon quite nicely there in terms of the kind of the smart, behind the meter, clever, algorithmic driven, high tech, digital savvy system of the future. Simon, is it going to work? Will it keep the lights on?
Yes, I mean, technology can deliver a lot of solutions for this, and it needs to work in the context of the right policy and financial environment. I mean, with our technology for behind the meter, we've got maybe 25,000 homes connected with 250 megawatt hours of storage, demonstrating that you can connect lots of homes together to control, as a virtual power plant, lots of batteries behind the meter. And we're currently doing the same. Those homes are actually in Japan, because there's a low cost of finance for batteries there, and the regulator allows us to do that. We're now doing the same with electric vehicles, which, as Juliet says, are batteries on wheels. The UK has a couple 100,000 electric vehicles that will be now mandated from 2030. And so if you play it forward, the UK will have around a terawatt hour of batteries in vehicles come 2040. And that's considerably larger than the sort of 10 gigawatt hours today in the UK battery fleet, which is about the same as Denoric, the pumped hydro plants in Wales. In the absence of the barrage from Juliet's colleagues, then we do need to have lots of storage in the UK to deliver on our net zero aspiration. Within the trend of the next 10 years, with a full electrification next decade of EVs, there's a lot of batteries. We've currently got a third of our electricity is renewable, and thanks to ongoing commitments in wind and solar and the 10 billion from Keith, that's going to increase. But we will be 2/3 renewable in the UK by the end of the decade. And now the UK itself is an island, and therefore 95% of our electricity today comes domestically. And therefore, as an island, as we move from 1/3 to 2/3 renewable intermittent generation, we do have a problem balancing and shifting all the solar to peak, or controlling when these millions of vehicles charge without causing a headache for Ofgem in regulating the grid for fairness. And therefore, we do need to use technology to manage millions of batteries in homes and cars very well in order to keep the lights on. Indeed, if we don't, we will have significant challenges with a drop in wind or a drop in solar. And as a nation state, as an island, we will have to get this right ahead of other nations. One of the reasons my company, Moitsu, does a lot of business in Japan is they are also an island. They don't get much power connection from North Korea nearby. They have to manage their shift away from nuclear and manage a new policy to match our net zero 2050 and 2060 targets and shift away to renewable energy. And so it is down to technology to manage lots of connected assets as a virtual power plant, to store and shift solar, to store and shift wind, to keep the lights on and manage down peaks. And the UK has quite a good flexibility infrastructure to do that, not because we want to, but because we have to. We don't have the interconnectors to Europe. Quite a lot of Central European nations have a problem with too much solar, but they have lots of interconnectors. So it's a financial market problem. They can buy and trade energy, buy excess nuclear. Indeed, Germany pays Austria 3 billion euros a year to take away its excess energy. They have negative prices on their wholesale market. We don't have that luxury because we don't have the wires to our friends in Europe. So we're physically disconnected in that respect, but we have to use technology to manage this well. But I think above all, it is down to the financing the policy argument. We do welcome the infrastructure bank. We do welcome the sentiment in the 10-point plan and the direction of travel. And it is a major breakthrough that the government realizes that green is no longer a cost. It is about jobs. It's about jobs today for a low carbon tomorrow. However, it is lacking in the speed, it is lacking in the scale, and it is lacking in the strategy to achieve net zero properly. I think governments tend to have a next election 4 to 5 year horizon, not a 2050
Surely not.
horizon. And as a consequence, we're not thinking long term. The Sustainable Development Goals require us to halve carbon in energy and mobility this decade. And a former chancellor estimated the cost of net zero at 500 billion. Now we've seen a few billion committed in different correct areas, and it's very difficult with so many claims on the magic money tree of the Chancellor's quantitative easing to actually fund both COVID recovery, climate recovery, jobs, keeping the economy going is very, very difficult unless you make all that money work for the same purpose. You make the jobs putting in infrastructure to make low carbon transportation. You make the jobs insulating people's homes. So rather than just have a low bill, you have a no bill. And it's really having a joined up strategy to make sure the money is allocated in the right place. We're not near the 500 billion needed. We are seeing direction of travel nudges in the right direction. And certainly the 75 billion euros Iberdrola committed recently, which Keith mentioned, is a significant step. But the governments do need to take the central debt. They have the lowest cost of debt available. Today, you can borrow so much money at government level. The government has got 400 billion of borrowing this year. It does need 1 trillion of borrowing to properly fund climate and COVID and jobs recovery and infrastructure. It needs to take that debt at low rate and then pass it on to the private sector at the appropriate time. Because full electrification is going to need a lot of infrastructure upgrade. And that needs to be joined up really super quickly, because we do need to deliver the 2030 target of halving carbon. And yes, that takes us on a direction travel to 2050, but unless in 2030 we have halved the carbon in energy and mobility, we're just not going to get there.
Thank you very much. I challenged Declan a bit earlier on whether government's still stuck in a sort of incumbent discourse of somewhere on the, yes, we like, great, lots of renewables, that's the future. Yes, lots of flex, that's the future. But we do still need this big reliable thing as well. Is that the case? Can a fully decentralized, smart, flexible system with all the technology you need and the vehicles and the batteries on wheels, can that produce kind of reliable, low cost power, or do we still need those big old-fashioned backup power stations?
We need several different technology and strategies running in parallel. It's certainly more efficient to make and keep energy local. If you make energy in the central grid using historic fossil fuels and transmit it over the grid, you're kind of losing 2/3 of the energy. If you keep energy from your solar on your roof in your home and you keep energy at the grid edge, you run a local load balancing, you run a net zero island in your home, in your street, in your city, and that's certainly the direction of travel. However, it can't work in isolation. Within the UK policy, nuclear is part of that equation, and the new mini nucleus of the future. Nuclear is still a low carbon technology. Now, there is a different world in 1970 where we went max out to nuclear. That universe doesn't have a carbon problem. It has a cancer problem, it might have a missing cities problem, but it doesn't have a carbon problem. So technologies like nuclear historically could have done things, but now they're not here. But you do need a combination of technologies to work, not just the distributed technologies. However, distributed technologies will take over. We're doubling our battery capacity in Japan every 6 months. We will have gigawatt hours. And if the financing mechanisms are correct in Central Europe, we would have tens of gigawatt hours pretty quickly under our control through software. And that's definitely going to happen with electric vehicles. The world is estimated to have 250 electric vehicles by 2030. That is around 10 to 15 terawatt hours of batteries. Trillions of pounds of batteries are going into vehicles. Last year, 100 gigawatts of batteries were made and into electric vehicles. There's a lot of money and asset value in the infrastructure in consumers' hands. And if consumers work together in swarms, and software allows us to do that, then it is going to be an unstoppable force in the grid, which regulators are starting to pay attention to. Now, the speed at which it happens is inevitable because of the economics of the vehicle ownership of low carbon vehicle, like electric vehicle, are significant. If you buy an electric vehicle, you're significantly saving on your maintenance, on your fuel. It costs £3 to fill up an electric vehicle, not £60, a 20-fold gain. And therefore, when you buy an electric vehicle, you're prepaying for all the fuel in your vehicle. And we published a paper the other day on net zero pensions, about how actually buying an electric vehicle is a sensible pension choice. And indeed, how we can fund the entire recovery by rethinking pensions is a paper we published yesterday. And we're very excited about, actually, we found a missing £1 trillion in the UK economy to enable this, because ultimately it is still a financial problem. How do you fund infrastructure? How do you reduce debt you build? And what are the technologies you do which can help that? But definitely, we do see the speed of consumer, the speed of the new products available, the speed of the technologies can deliver net zero and half carbon. And so as technologies, I'm confident technology can deliver. As a policy, we do need a conducive environment to keep. We need a local policy regime which enables the technology to do its job. And we do need a financing regime to enable the correct funding to be allocated to create the markets ahead of need. We can't wait and catch up to one of the questions I saw around. We bought millions of vaccines ahead of them even being finished testing, ahead of the need. We know we need the vaccine. We know we need net zero. We must buy some of these technologies and set the policies now, even before some of them are fully available.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. Lots to think about in there. I should say that one of our delegates, Maria, who's from TLT, kind sponsors of this series, is a victim of UK infrastructure, and that the internet in her village has gone down. So thank you, Maria and TLT, for your support. Declan, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, we've had some very impassioned contributions and also some quite radical, some points that we do need a lot of radical change in the system and the finance operation. The world of technology and energy is moving so fast. I mean, an incredibly difficult challenge for government to sort of set a framework in a world, with so much change and so much urgency. You've talked about some of the reviews of the system operation, of renewables support, need for more flex. is government able to keep up, I guess, with this agenda?
Yeah, an incredibly interesting morning. A lot of really interesting, rich things in there, and I think loads of it I'd absolutely agree with. I think we sort of have to. I think the idea of what are we doing to Pete's point, setting a clear vision of where we need to be in the 2050 timeframe. I think it's becoming a little bit clearer. There's an awful lot of uncertainty, but there are things we do know. We're going to have a lot of renewables on the system. We're going to have to manage that as efficiently as possible. And we do think there's a role for complementary technologies, however you describe them, like nuclear, powered CCS, for example. So I think the challenge of the 20s is, within all that uncertainty, what do we know and what can we get on with now? So I think there is a balance between striking agility, but then I guess one of the exciting things as a policymaker is you do hear conflicting views sometimes. So we need speed, we need agility, and then there needs to be the right balance of targets and as well, I suppose. So there are some interesting trade-offs, but given all the expertise, innovation, and enthusiasm, I think real political commitment, to Sam's point, I think I'm very confident that we're seeing kind of real momentum. We know what the challenges are. That's not to understate the challenges, which is important. But sometimes I think it's important to kind of not make them look completely insurmountable or people's heads can fall. This is an exciting opportunity. It's an industrial opportunity. We can engage society more widely. I can tell you there's a lot of enthused people in this building about it. So challenges are plenty for sure, but kind of more momentum than I've sort of ever seen. And then, Merlin, I'm sure from your side as well, it feels like there is a real moment.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've been around it 25 years odd, and as have many others on this, and where it is definitely at a very different point in the seriousness of the agenda, and I think that net zero legal target is really kind of still flowing through everyone's thinking. Keith, can I ask if you're reassured by what you've heard from Declan there and Neil before? Is that?
Yeah, look, I think, look, the great thing is, I think everybody wants the same, and everybody's aiming in the same direction, and the debate's just about how do you get there, and the speed at which you get there, and the process through which you get there, and when I lay out these challenges, it's not to have a poke or a dig at people. It's just these are there are big issues out there that need debated, and I think Juliet made a fantastic observation, about the heat system, and if you look at, we're really accelerating on renewables. You see the push and the trajectory on EVs, but heat's not really gone anywhere because we've kind of struggled as a country to make the strategic decision. Are we going electric, or are we going hydrogen, or are we going some other answer? So the market doesn't quite know which way it's meant to be pointing or focused right now, and those are the kind of decisions we need to make, I think, quite quickly. I think the other thing, and it came up in a couple of bits of the conversation as well, was about the decision making, and I noted carefully Neil's comments about T2 and the transmission system, etc., which is fine, and I'm kind of hoping when I wake up on the 9th of December, it's like and I open my T2 final determination, it'll be like an early Christmas present. But we'll see, and we'll have that debate at the time. But if I look at, in some ways, the bigger challenge for all of us is around the EV, the heat, and the localization, because when you're starting to talk about transport and heat, you're talking really about people's lives, people's day-to-day existence. At one level, wind farms are things that are there, they're done, and they provide clean energy, and it's brilliant and it's fantastic. It doesn't really impact your life per se on a day-to-day basis. Transport and heat do, and they're also interlinked with local authorities' own regeneration plans. They're linked with clean air plans. They're linked with so many other things. And I think, again, this is where we really need to question the models we've got, because how can you make those decisions from centralized places, like a centralized regulator, centralized government, or even centralized companies? So for example, if you take Liverpool as a big city, big mayoral region, right now, in terms of the distribution system for Liverpool, that decision's made between myself as the distribution company, working with Ofgem around the distribution plan. Where's the voice of the Liverpool mayor and the local authority and the council? And how do we make sure actually what's being delivered is what they need, what they want? Who's better placed to say where the charge points need to go in Liverpool than the city council? Who's better placed to work out how you decarbonise the heat system in Liverpool than the people of Liverpool? Yet that, again, the kind of processes, systems and mechanisms we have in place aren't really designed for that. They're designed for big centralised decision making. And again, it's about very quickly and very rapidly, we need to decentralise that process. So you hear people talking about decentralising the technology, distributed generation, et cetera, and that's all great and it's all correct and it's all brilliant. You hear people, some of the speakers have talked about, mobile batteries in effect, putting our cars on mobile battery. That's all being decentralised. Our processes haven't been at all. So how do we decentralise them very quickly to match what's happening in the real world? And I think that's where we need to go. Okay,
thank you, Keith. Just very quick response on that, Neil, if I may. Regen published a paper actually called Energy Networks for the Future last year. We set out a new model. We talked about regional energy kind of organisations having a statutory role in the price control setting for their areas. Is Ofgem going to let go of some control?
So I would argue that there are things that we do control in the interest of energy consumers, but actually by setting a market framework, if we get those incentives working in the right way, then developers and communities and local authorities can take the steps they need, responding to sensible price signals, and you get the investment flowing in the right way with that degree of local input. And on the Rio process, I think we've had an unprecedented level of engagement with a wide range of stakeholders to try and ensure that those views are being heard as part of the process. So I think we are trying to be on the front foot with this stuff, and it's difficult to get that balance right, but I think we're making progress.
I guess just if the mayor of just taking Keith's example of the mayor of Liverpool, we actually launched that paper, Energy Networks for the Future in Liverpool. Says we want to go great guns, we want to go on electric heating, we want to go the hell out of EVs, we need lots of charging, and we need the infrastructure to enable it. And then Keith puts in his plans to say, this is how much I need to meet what Liverpool wants to do. And Ofgem says, oh no, that's far too much, can't spend that. Is that right? Should the dead hand of the Whitehall bureaucrat be
absolutely. I'd say that's not at all where we expect to be. So we will be supporting the net zero investment wherever that occurs. So if one local authority or one nation, say Scotland or whatever, chooses to go faster, and that requires more network investment to support that, then we're going to support that, because every bit of the country is going to get to this point to the net zero destination. If some parts of the country want to go faster, I think we should absolutely be there supporting that investment. So I don't think Ofgem will be a barrier to those examples.
Excellent. Okay, Sam, I was going to come back to you at this point. I mean, going through a number of great experts, people embedded in the energy system and thinking about this transition. One of the points that comes across is there's quite a lot of detail about the regulation of the process and the infrastructure and the like, which from personal experience I know is I've only met one Tory, maybe two Tory MPs that have some vague understanding of this kind of world, or any MP, not just Tories. It's is a lot. Now we set out the direction. Is a lot of the action in the kind of the system, and is there a challenge in the kind of understanding of the political class of the kind of realities of what needs to happen?
I think that is broadly fair. That a lot of the, your average MP, with all the different issues that they have to deal with in their constituency, all the correspondence and all the range of policy issues that they have to deal with, as well as all the kind of politics of Parliament that they're thinking about as well, don't have detailed grasp of the energy market as some of the experts on this call, whose full-time job it is. I think there is definitely a tendency to focus on easier to understand concepts like the amount of offshore wind we want on the grid, or the concept of the switch to EVs. I don't think that means that there isn't interest, and there are some things which do prick MPs' attention. So one obvious example that I can think of is the transmission network bringing the power from some of the offshore wind farms back onshore, and some of those Suffolk MPs who want to see more coordination of those onshore connections. That is an area where you do get MPs prodding and poking at some of the decisions that Ofgem and others are making. So yeah, it's not always the case, definitely. But no, I think broadly speaking, I think MPs are excited and positive about the future of a decentralized electricity system. I think there is, lots of support for renewables, for offshore wind in particular, for electric vehicles too. So I don't think it speaks to a lack of interest in the agenda. I think it's just inevitably the level of detail, and all those confusing acronyms that Ofgem has that's very hard to follow for anyone really that isn't immersed in this every day.
I might get your perspective rather than asking Declan. Is there any chance of overturning the ban in planning on onshore wind in England that came out back in a previous world of Conservative administrations?
I hope so. I think the decision to hold a pot one auction earlier this year shows that what looked like a fairly unmovable policy decision of a previous Conservative government, could be changed. And I think the reception of that CFD pot one auction, I thought, was pretty good. There wasn't much opposition raised to that. I think a big part of that was, to be honest, because there was a lot of reassurance given about the planning system in England. But I know that there are Conservative MPs who think that there should be a way for local communities to choose to host an offshore wind farm in their constituency. And I think as we need and progress towards net zero, we need more low carbon power on the grid. I think if you want to deliver that at lowest cost to consumers, and there are some attractive community benefit schemes that onshore developers are bringing forward as well. And I could definitely see some MPs, championing this. I know people like Richard Graham, Kevin Horneregg have all spoken on the record about this. So I definitely, I hope that it will happen one day. But yeah, I mean that it probably is still difficult at the moment, I'd say.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Juliet, we are come back to yourself. We are all too soon coming towards the end of our time. It's very quickly. I guess reflections on that, particularly on the kind of local, the consumer, bringing people along with us. This kind of change from top down to much more activism at local areas and communities and local authorities.
You have another swimming pool example or something? Yeah, is that what you're looking for?
Exactly. Give me one of those, Juliet. That's it.
I mean, slightly differently than that. I'm going to respond to something that was kind of being talked about a little bit, and actually we kind of haven't pulled that a little bit further, is the transformation into heat. And what is quite interesting at the moment, and I think one of the pieces of work that we've been seeing in terms of engaging consumers on that, is that right now, all the support for new renewables and its new renewable electricity transition goes onto the electricity bill. None of that ends up on our gas bill. And right now, so we've got a gas bill, which is a high carbon sort of technology, essentially, that we've got in our homes. We've got small internal combustion engines with no carbon tax on it, effectively. And you kind of do wonder whether we need to think about how we transition to support this transition, because we're going to be taking away gas and putting in more electric. Surely some of that should be supported by these bills. It would also then flow through to the consumer to be able to make better decisions about things like heat pumps or end use technologies. Because I came up with a bit of policy on the go, so I hope you don't mind if I share it. I just had a bit of thought because it's quite difficult to solve. But what you could do is you could put a carbon tax essentially on gas electricity bills and use that to support CFDs, FIT and ROCs, and then reduce the cost on the electricity bill. So you end up with a balance, but it's a self-regulating mechanism. Anyway, that's just one to add in. I don't know whether it'll work, but it's just an idea.
Well, thank you, Julia. It so happens that I've mentioned one Regen paper. We also published a paper on decarbonising heat earlier this year, and our sort of headline recommendation was shifting the burden of the kind of tax on the energy bills from electricity onto gas in a kind of on a decarbonisation basis.
I think so that keeps your fairness, Merlin. I think it
Yeah.
keeps your fairness, and it makes everybody move in the same direction. And it also gets people aligned behind the right technology, because otherwise you've got this mismatch in the system that you're asking consumers to make the wrong choice.
Excellent. Declan, I know it can be slightly career ending to speak for Treasury, big Treasury decisions on tax, and this clearly is a sensitive area. And I think Sam kind of pointed to us before. I think he used the word election losing in a sort of similar around this kind of area. So we're just coming towards the end. So a kind of final comment, and perhaps specifically, is that up for debate, that the structure of the tax system around energy?
So I think you probably answered the question for me. I dare not tread on fiscal matters for Team Treasury. I would point, I think, to the kind of the net zero review Treasury colleagues are working on. I think we'll look at some interesting questions around kind of who pays, distributional impacts, and so forth. So I think it's something that's been kind of lodged and acknowledged as a question, and I think they're the right people to be looking at it given they have the fiscal mandate, and I think that would be an important part of the puzzle.
Okay. Any final thoughts you've heard from today? Any kind of last thing you think people should be looking out for, or signal towards the energy white paper, or key decisions?
Absolutely looking forward to publishing the energy white paper. As you say, Merlin, there's going to be kind of more things coming out during the course of next year. You mentioned the building strategy, for example. So I expect a real cadence. Obviously, we've got COP next year as well, so we'll be kind of growing slightly leading up to that. And then, yeah, I would echo Keith's point today. It's going to be around deliverability and dropping into delivering some of these programs.
Excellent. Okay, Keith, I think we'll come to you for the kind of final comment. How you feeling any more optimistic or less optimistic at the end of today? And interesting that COP that's the first time we've actually mentioned COP. Maybe we've been so buried in the kind of detail that we've kind of forgotten that in a year we'll highlight it. We're hosting the world's next climate change conference.
Yeah, look, there's a huge amount to be optimistic about, and there's colossal opportunities out there. And I think that's what the best thing about the 10-point plan is it shows you the size of the opportunity. And that's an opportunity for companies, for investors, for stakeholders, for consumers, for governments, in terms of jobs, manufacturing, etc. There's just opportunity. And if we get this right, we'll hit the numbers, we'll hit the targets, but better than that, we'll reverse the impacts of climate change, we'll deliver net zero, and consumers will get a better way of life, because it will be clean energy, it will be less pollution, it will be a better environment for everybody to live in, and we will be creating jobs, and we'll be creating wealth for the economy. So that's what we need to stay focused on, the size of this opportunity. This isn't a burden. It shouldn't be made to look difficult. It shouldn't be made to look like there's anybody losing out here. If we get the frameworks right, we get the models right, everyone wins. And that's the important thing for us to stay focused on.
Excellent. Well, Keith, a great point to end on. I don't know whether you'll be pleased, but in the chat, you've been nominated for Energy Minister. So if you're looking for a change of career path, there we are. Excellent. Look, it really remains for me only to I'm not going to try and sum up everything we've heard, partly because we're out of time, partly because we've covered a huge amount of ground. I mean, an exciting and optimistic time, though. I heard from quite a lot of people with a lot of questions about deliverability and a lot of work for a lot of people to do. But that's a great position for us to be in. A huge amount of stuff due next year. If you look at the 10-point plan at the end of it, that brochure, there's a sort of diagram showing all the strategies coming up next year, and it's quite eye-watering. So I imagine Declan's got a little bit of work still to do. Hasn't quite finished, but so yeah, I just wanted to thank all the panelists for their contributions. To say to everyone that, of course, there'll be further regen sessions coming up, and as many of all of you know, we are a membership organisation. So if you want to join the path to a zero carbon future and work with us on that, then our website is always available. I should thank again TLT and WICSA for their support of today's session, and of course most most important, and finally, thank all of you for giving up your time today and participating and contributing, and to probably a record lively chat function on today, which it seems to have broken Zoom because it says 99 plus. So obviously Zoom can't cope with more than 99 chats, and telling us that there's more than 99 contributions on the chat. So you've broken Zoom's chat function. So thank you for that and for participating so actively. We shall let you go, and thank you once again, and have a great rest of the day.
Brilliant. Thank you again, Martin. Cheers.
Thanks all. Thanks, Keith.